Suzuki once had the kind of reputation most motorcycle brands dream about. In huge parts of Asia, it meant practical, trusted, everyday transportation. A bike you could ride hard, repair, and depend on. But today, that old strength is starting to crack. Not because Suzuki forgot how to build motorcycles, but because the battle changed. Riders are not only asking which bike is good anymore. They are asking which one is easier to finance, easier to fix, easier to resell, and easier to keep on the road when life gets rough. That is where Suzuki's real problem begins. The warning signs are quiet, but they are serious. Watch till the end. Because what pushed riders away from Suzuki may be the same thing changing the entire motorcycle market right now. What's happening? Suzuki kept building solid motorcycles, but they did not pivot fast enough toward that reality. Competitors started designing bikes that could survive neglect. Not just run well when maintained, but keep going when maintenance is inconsistent or delayed. That is a completely different design philosophy. One focuses on performance. The other focuses on survival. You can feel the difference after a few hard seasons. The bike that keeps starting, keeps running, keeps earning trust. Riders notice that. Mechanics notice it faster. And once that reputation shifts, it spreads without advertising. At that point, the conversation changes. It is no longer about how good the bike feels new. It becomes about whether it will still be running when everything else starts wearing out. A different barrier shows up before the engine even matters. Financing battle. The second reason is simple, and it hits earlier than most people think. Riders are not choosing bikes first. They are choosing what they can afford to get into. That means payments, not total price. Financing has quietly taken over the decision. Most buyers are not walking in with cash anymore. They are looking at what they can manage every month. That changes everything. A bike that looks affordable on paper can lose instantly if the entry cost feels heavy. Competitors figured that out early. They built strong financing networks, flexible credit options, and easier ways to ride out of the dealership. Suzuki did not move as aggressively in that direction. That creates a gap before comparisons even begin. By the time a rider starts thinking about reliability or performance, the decision is already leaning somewhere else. Access beats specification every time. Once enough riders start following that path, the shift becomes invisible but powerful. The best machine does not win. The easiest one to own does. Step inside a dealership, and the next piece of the puzzle becomes obvious. If this is starting to connect, take a second to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And I want your take. Have you seen this shift yourself, or is it being overlooked where you ride? Showroom bias. Walk into a showroom and watch what happens. Not what is on paper, but what is actually being pushed. Salespeople do not present every option equally. They guide you, sometimes directly, sometimes without you noticing. That guidance follows one thing: what makes the business work. Margins matter, incentives matter, inventory pressure matters. If one brand gives better returns or moves faster, it gets attention. That is just how the system operates. Suzuki, in several markets, has not always been the easiest brand for dealers to prioritize. That changes what gets recommended. You might think you are choosing freely, but your options are already shaped before you decide. The bike that gets talked about more, explained better, and offered with confidence starts to feel like the right choice. The one that sits quietly in the background fades out. You do not always get shown the best bike. You get shown the one that moves. Over time, that becomes a silent filter across the entire market. Riders stop considering what they are not encouraged to look at. That is where Suzuki starts losing before the engine is even discussed. If the dealer sounds more confident about Honda, Yamaha, Bajaj, or TVS, the buyer feels it. Trust transfers in that moment, not through a spec sheet, but through the person standing between the rider and the key itself. That quiet shift leads straight into a deeper issue most people do not notice right away: brand confusion. After all of that, the bigger problem becomes clear. Suzuki no longer has a defined place. It is not the cheapest option for riders who need basic transportation. It is not the most advanced option for riders chasing refinement or features. That leaves it sitting in the middle. The middle is where decisions fall apart. When riders compare options, they look for a clear reason to choose, something that stands out immediately. If that reason is missing, hesitation sets in, and hesitation kills sales faster than poor quality. When you cannot tell what a bike is supposed to be, you start looking for something that makes more sense. That shift does not happen all at once. It happens slowly. Fewer recommendations, fewer repeat buyers, less excitement around new models. That is dangerous, because riders need certainty. If Honda means dependability, Yamaha means refinement, and Bajaj or TVS means value, Suzuki needs a sharper reason to exist. Without it, the badge stays familiar, but no longer decisive when buying today. Over time, that turns into a pattern. Not a crash, not a headline, just a steady drift away from the brand. And once that pattern locks in, fixing it takes more than releasing a new bike. That hesitation does not stay in the showroom. It follows riders onto the road. And that is where the next set of problems begins to show. Slow evolution. At first, nothing looks wrong. You swing a leg over the bike, fire it up, and it runs fine, smooth enough, predictable, nothing that immediately sets off alarms. That is what makes this problem harder to catch. It is not about failure, it is about stagnation. Over time, riders started noticing something subtle. New models did not feel new. They felt familiar in a way that was not comforting. The controls, the response, the overall ride character stayed too close to what had already been on the road for years. Meanwhile, other brands kept making small improvements. Better throttle feel, cleaner fueling, more refined transmissions. Nothing dramatic on its own, but together it added up. You ride something else, then come back, and the difference stands out. Not because one bike is bad, but because one has clearly moved forward while the other stayed in place. That is where the perception begins to shift. You ride something new, and it feels like something you rode 10 years ago. For some riders, that is fine. For others, it becomes a reason to look elsewhere. The riders feel it first, but the ones turning wrenches catch it sooner. Garage verdict. Spend enough time around a workshop and patterns start to show. Not the kind you see in brochures or reviews, but the kind that builds up after hundreds of repairs, services, and repeat visits. Mechanics notice which bikes come back often, which ones are easy to work on, and which ones they trust without hesitation. That trust matters more than most people realize. When someone asks for advice, the answer does not come from marketing. It comes from experience. A mechanic will recommend what they have seen hold up over time. That recommendation carries weight, especially in markets where riders depend on their machines every day. Suzuki did not suddenly become unreliable. That is not the point. The shift happened in preference. Other brands started becoming the first suggestion. Not because Suzuki failed, but because competitors felt like a safer bet. That difference is small at first, but it grows. The guy fixing bikes all day sees patterns nobody else does. Once his opinion changes, it spreads through riders faster than any advertisement ever could. Those quiet shifts begin to show themselves once the bikes are pushed beyond normal use. Built for abuse. There is a difference between how a bike is designed and how it ends up being used. On paper, the design makes sense. Balanced performance, reasonable durability, acceptable maintenance intervals. In reality, the bike gets loaded beyond expectations, ridden on rough roads, and kept running far longer between services than any engineer would prefer. That is where the gap starts to open. Some machines are built to tolerate that kind of abuse. Others are built for conditions that assume a certain level of care. When those assumptions do not match reality, problems begin to surface. Not always as failures, but as wear that shows up sooner than expected. Riders adapt. They learn which bikes can take it and which ones need more attention. Over time, they choose accordingly. The machine that survives the worst conditions becomes the one they trust. Some bikes are built for riding, others are built for surviving. That distinction becomes clear when the miles pile up under real-world pressure. The real test is not how a bike performs under ideal conditions, but how it holds up when pushed beyond expectations. Riders learn through experience which machines can take that pressure. That knowledge spreads through communities, shaping decisions without needing formal reviews or structured comparisons between different models in everyday use situations. Once that mismatch becomes obvious, the cost is no longer measured in repairs alone. Downtime cost. Breakdowns happen with any machine. That is part of ownership. What matters more is how long it takes to get back on the road. In many of these markets, a motorcycle is not just transportation. It is income, access, and daily function. When it stops, everything around it slows down. Delays start to matter more than the problem itself. Waiting for parts, waiting for repairs, waiting for availability. That time adds up. A bike that sits for days or weeks becomes a liability, even if it is otherwise reliable. Riders begin to factor that into their decisions. It is not the failure that drives them away. It is the waiting, the uncertainty, the sense that getting back on the road takes longer than it should. That experience stays with them the next time they consider a purchase. It is not the failure, it is how long you are stuck waiting. That is the part that changes behavior. Consistency matters more than perfection in these situations. A bike that keeps running without interruption builds confidence. Delays break that confidence quickly. Riders start planning around reliability, not just performance. Over time, the machines that minimize disruption become the ones that define value in practical terms, for everyday use and long-term ownership. When that pattern repeats, riders stop debating and start choosing differently without saying much at all. Silent rider exit. The real damage does not show up in complaints. It shows up in silence. When riders are unhappy, they do not always argue, write reviews, or make noise. Most of the time, they just stop coming back. That is how brand loss actually happens, not through backlash, but through absence. It starts quietly. A rider who owned one Suzuki moves to something else without much thought. Then another follows. No big statement, no emotional break, just a different decision the next time money is on the table. Over time, that becomes a pattern. The conversations around the brand begin to fade. Fewer recommendations, fewer mentions in real discussions, less presence where it matters. That silence is more dangerous than criticism. At least, criticism keeps a brand in the conversation. When riders stop talking about it entirely, the connection is already gone. When a rider stops bringing up a brand, that is usually the point where it has already lost its place in their mind. From the outside, nothing looks dramatic. Sales may decline slowly, not collapse, but inside that trend is a deeper shift that is much harder to reverse. Loyalty does not break loudly, it fades. That absence is difficult to measure directly, but it shows up in long-term trends. A steady decline in engagement signals something deeper than short-term dissatisfaction. When riders move on without returning, it reflects a shift in perception that is not easily corrected through marketing or minor product updates within the same competitive space. What makes it worse is how companies often respond when they start feeling that pressure. If you've made it this far, subscribe now, because this is exactly where most people miss what really matters. We break down what others ignore, and what's coming next in this story is something every serious rider needs to understand. Ride quality. When margins tighten and sales begin to soften, companies look for ways to protect themselves. That usually leads to cost-cutting decisions. On paper, those decisions look reasonable. Small adjustments, minor changes, nothing that should affect the overall product too much. But the impact rarely stays on paper. Over time, those choices begin to show up in ways riders can feel. Materials change, components get slightly cheaper. Finishing details become less refined. None of it is obvious in isolation. You do not notice it in a single ride or a quick comparison. But over months and years, it adds up. The riding experience starts to shift in subtle ways. A bit more vibration, slightly rougher operation, parts that wear sooner than expected. Riders might not point to a specific flaw, but they recognize that something is different. That feeling matters more than specifications. You might not see the change, but you feel it over time. That feeling influences trust. Once trust starts to weaken, every small issue carries more weight than it used to. Small adjustments often go unnoticed individually, but their combined effect becomes clear over time. Riders may not identify the exact cause, but they recognize the change in overall feel. That recognition influences future decisions, especially when alternatives offer a more consistent experience without those gradual compromises affecting long-term ownership, satisfaction, and confidence levels. Those small compromises do not stay small forever. They build into something larger that cannot be ignored. Lost identity. Beyond the product itself, something else begins to fade. The identity of the brand. There was a time when each manufacturer stood for something clear. You could name a brand and immediately know what to expect. That clarity made decisions easier. As Suzuki lost ground, that clarity began to blur. It was no longer obvious what set the brand apart. Not the cheapest, not the most advanced, not the most durable in extreme conditions. That leaves riders without a clear reason to commit. When identity fades, emotional connection follows. Riders are not just buying machines. They are buying confidence, familiarity, and a sense of knowing what they are getting. When that disappears, the brand becomes just another option instead of a preferred choice. Every brand used to stand for something, and you did not have to think about it. Once that instinct is gone, it becomes harder to rebuild than any mechanical issue. It is no longer about fixing a product. It is about restoring meaning. Without a clear identity, comparisons become more difficult for buyers. They rely on stronger signals from competing brands to guide their decisions. Over time, that weakens the connection between rider and manufacturer. Rebuilding that connection requires more than improving products, because it involves restoring clarity in how the brand is perceived overall. That loss of identity becomes even more complicated when decisions are made far from where the bikes are actually being used. One-plan failure. A single global strategy can look efficient from the top, but it often misses what riders need on the ground. Different regions demand different things. Riding conditions, maintenance habits, fuel quality, usage patterns. All of these vary widely, and they shape what works and what does not. When a company moves too slowly to adapt to those differences, the gap becomes visible. A bike that performs well in one market may struggle in another. Riders notice when a machine feels out of place for their environment. That mismatch creates frustration, even if the bike itself is not fundamentally flawed. What works in one place does not always work somewhere else. That sounds obvious, but it requires constant adjustment to get right. Competitors that respond faster to local needs begin to pull ahead. They refine their products based on real feedback, not just global planning. As that gap grows, it becomes harder to close. Riders gravitate toward brands that feel built for them, not just sold to them. And once they make that switch, they rarely come back quickly. Adaptation requires attention to detail and responsiveness to feedback. When that process slows down, competitors gain an advantage. They respond more directly to local needs and refine their offerings accordingly. Over time, that responsiveness builds loyalty, while slower adjustments create distance between the brand and the riders it is trying to serve. While that distance increases, other companies do not hesitate to move into the space that has been left open. Rivals move fast. When one brand slows down, others do not hesitate. That is the nature of this industry. There is no empty space for long. As Suzuki lost ground in certain areas, competitors began filling those gaps quietly, not with big announcements, but with consistent presence where it mattered most. You start seeing it in small ways: more bikes from other brands on the road, more availability in local markets, better support systems showing up around those machines. Over time, those small signs add up to something larger. Riders begin to associate reliability, access, and convenience with different names. In this industry, if you leave space, someone fills it. That is not a threat. It is a rule. The brands that move faster, listen closer, and adapt quicker take over the ground that was once held by others. And once they establish themselves, they do not give it back easily. What makes this shift more important is that it is not just about better bikes. It is about better systems surrounding those bikes. That is where the real competition has moved. Growth in these areas often goes unnoticed at first. It builds through consistent presence and reliability. Riders begin to recognize these alternatives as dependable choices. Over time, that recognition becomes preference. Once a competitor establishes that position, it becomes harder for others to reclaim the same level of trust in those markets. The reason becomes clearer once you look at how the entire business has changed. Ownership ecosystem. There was a time when the motorcycle itself was the center of everything. If the machine was strong, reliable, and well-built, that was enough to compete. That is no longer the case. The business has expanded far beyond the product sitting in the showroom. Today, the system around the bike carries just as much weight as the bike itself. Financing, parts availability, service networks, resale value, and ease of ownership all shape the decision. Riders are not just buying a machine, they are stepping into an ecosystem. It used to be about the machine, now it is about everything around it. A bike that performs well but lacks support will struggle against one that is backed by a stronger system. That includes how easy it is to maintain, how quickly it can be repaired, and how affordable it is to keep running. This shift changes what success looks like. It is no longer enough to build a good motorcycle. You have to build the entire experience around it. Brands that understand that move ahead. Those that do not begin to fall behind, even if their products remain solid. This broader approach changes expectations across the board. Riders begin to evaluate brands based on how well they support ownership, not just how the bike performs. That shift rewards companies that invest in complete systems. Over time, the gap between product quality and ownership experience becomes more visible and more important in decision-making. That broader shift starts influencing what riders eventually end up owning. Trusted machines fade. As the industry changes, something familiar begins to disappear. The kind of machines that built their reputation on simplicity and durability are becoming harder to find, not because they cannot be made, but because the priorities around them have shifted. Modern bikes are more complex, more systems, more electronics, more layers between the rider and the machine. That brings advantages, but it also changes the ownership experience. What used to be straightforward becomes more dependent on specialized service and structured support. You start realizing the bikes you trusted do not exist the same way anymore. The ones that could handle rough use, minimal maintenance, and still keep going are being replaced by machines that expect a different kind of care. For some riders, that is acceptable. For others, it changes how they think about ownership entirely. That shift is not tied to one brand. It reflects a broader direction across the industry. As expectations evolve, so do the machines. The balance between simplicity and advancement becomes harder to maintain. As complexity increases, the relationship between rider and machine changes. Maintenance becomes less direct, and ownership becomes more dependent on structured systems. Some riders adapt to that shift, while others look for alternatives that preserve simplicity. That divide shapes the market in ways that are still developing across different regions today. That leads directly to the final question about where all of this is heading. Industry warning. Looking at all of this together, it becomes clear that this is not just about Suzuki. It is about how quickly things can change when a brand falls out of alignment with the people using its machines. The process is gradual, but the outcome can be decisive. Brands do not usually collapse all at once. It happens piece by piece. A shift in design focus, a delay in adapting to new conditions. Slow loss of trust among riders and mechanics. Each step seems manageable on its own. Together, they reshape the entire position of the company. Recovery is possible, but it requires more than improving the product. It means rebuilding the system around it. Access, support, trust, and relevance all have to come back into alignment. Without that, even a strong machine cannot carry the brand forward. What you are seeing is a pattern that has played out before. Not identical, but familiar enough to recognize. When the connection between a brand and its riders weakens, the result is rarely immediate, but it is rarely temporary either. Recognizing these patterns early provides a clearer understanding of where the industry is heading. It highlights the importance of alignment between product, system, and rider expectations. Without that alignment, even established brands can lose relevance over time. The outcome depends on how quickly those gaps are addressed and corrected moving forward. Suzuki's story is not just about one company losing ground. It is about what happens when riders, dealers, and mechanics slowly stop seeing a brand as the obvious choice. The bikes may still be solid, but trust is harder to rebuild once it fades. Now I want to hear from you. Would you still buy a Suzuki today? Or has another brand earned your confidence? Comment below, hit like, and subscribe for more real motorcycle breakdowns.